Bon. On reste dans un retard qui est, disons, acceptable, je ne sais pas, mais enfin...
Well, we are starting slightly late. I don't know whether it's an acceptable delay, but that's the last session of the day and also the last debate on during this session of, or rather installment of ATHS. So we got into the habit to organize a society debate. There was one on Tuesday dedicated to the use of drugs during the COVID crisis. And this debate, this second debate, has to do with the drug policies between prohibition and legalization. So we're going to discuss the new developments. I'm going to introduce you to the speakers. Ivana OBRADOVIC, she's the Deputy Director of the Observatory for Drugs. She's going to present an international review of the situation at the international level, so when it comes to the regulatory framework. Then we'll listen to the American experience, which is very heterogeneous depending on the states. And this presentation will be made by John HUDAK. He's an expert in political science, has been interested in those questions in the United States for many, many years, and now a fixture in this debate. Milton ROMANI is an ambassador from Uruguay, but in a previous career, he was a teacher in psychopathology, and in Uruguay, he was in charge of drug policies during the junta period. So during that specific period of the Uruguayan political scene, so to speak, he was in charge of the regulations around recreative usage of drugs, cannabis in particular. And so we'll brush a quick landscape of the situation in Uruguay. Also, among the panel members, we will have Professor Ben Margot, is a member of the Academy of Sciences, and is also the writer of the HOG report, a report which was also made at the demand of Bernard Kouchner when he was a minister. And so it's very important that he's here, because we will be, of course, making reference to his report, because prohibition of drugs, of which cannabis is one, is the result of public health regulations, which are based depending on the danger level of those drugs. And so when regulations are drafted or passed or modified, we should, of course, keep in mind that those drugs are not prohibited for moral reasons. They are prohibited on the basis of the respective dangerosity, the impact on health situation at large. At a point, alcohol was prohibited in the United States before this prohibition was eventually removed, not because alcohol is not dangerous, but because the deleterious impact on society and the impact and the consequences with the rise of the different mafias. Now, when it comes to the impacts of prohibitions, we also have Christophe BERLIOCCHI, is a journalist at Sud-Ouest, and he will have a book out, The War of Drugs in Marseille. And so this is a rather in-depth study of what's happening in Marseille, the connection between drug trafficking and the different issues in that city of the southeast of France, the questions of violence and also the mafias in Marseille. Bernard Kouchner should have been here, former Minister of Health. Maybe he'll be there tomorrow via video conference, but unfortunately, he lost a close member of his family. And for that reason, he's not here. I'm sure he's here in the thinking, but he was there last year, and I hope he'll be there next time. But this year wasn't possible for him for family reasons. Now, without further ado, we're going to start this debate. The presentations or conferences in themselves are going to be as short as possible because we really want the debate to be as interactive as possible. So we've kindly asked the speaker to really reduce their presentations. And so without further ado, because I've talked too much already, I'm going to ask Ivana OBRADOVIC to present a general landscape of the international situation. Thank you very much, Jean-Pierre. Good afternoon to everybody. Thank you very much to the organizers for this debate and this invitation to already have a first snapshot of the results of different legal frameworks. I'm going to start with a couple of comments. Of course, we can only look back at 7 years for the pioneer states, Uruguay, Colorado, and the state of Washington, 3 years in Canada. So we're looking back only on a few years of experience in those different states or countries. Second remark, it's always difficult to always explain changes by the impacts of regulations. There are changes in behaviors as well, and changes in behaviors are explained by multi-dimensional factors, of which regulations. And also, we also have a question on the freedom of the different sources. We know that there are private interests mixed in that debate, and so the data are produced by stakeholders that sometimes are not independent, and there are a number of think tanks around those questions, for example, in the United States, and we know that those sources are not always necessarily independent. Now, of course, they provide data a lot quicker than other sources. Their data are available quickly, but you need to take them with a pinch of salt because they may have conflict of interests. And so you should take that into account in the interpretation of the data. I'm going to point at a number of rather significant evolutions, especially those changes that were measured by a number of different institutes, which I'll be mentioning as I go. So some statistical information, and there are some facts as well that are very difficult to measure, especially the impact on black markets. My presentation will be structured on the different types of effects which were claimed but to happen by the reforms. I will talking about the impacts, economic impact on the market, the impact on public health, and the impacts on safety and crime. Now, those are the different initiatives of legalization by countries. The United States are the country in which a lot of attention, of international attention, is paid to what's happening in the United States. 19 out of 50 states have legalized. That's in deep green, and so they have legalized the use of cannabis for recreative use. That's 44% of the general population in the third most populated country of the world. You should know that all states also legalized the medical use of cannabis, except for South Dakota. Now, of course, those initiatives are gaining momentum. 5 states legalized: New Jersey, New York, New Mexico, Virginia, and Connecticut. So that was in the first months of 2021. So they are jumping on a sort of bandwagon. And among the pioneer states, there are a number of common traits. Those are mostly Democrat states with a history of more liberal reforms, for example, gay marriage or abolition of the death penalty. And as well, they have a different stance on cannabis. Now we have also Uruguay and Canada were the first country of G7 with that rather original policy, because it was imposed at the federal level, but it's also a decentralized scheme. So the distribution conditions are defined by the provinces, but there are also a number of federal regulations. From a demographic point of view, we're talking about 185 million people who live in this jurisdiction where the use and possession of cannabis for recreative use is authorized. So we're talking about 2.5% of the world population, which is not much. That's 1 habitant in 5 on the American continent. Now, this is a sort of long-lasting phenomenon, and as I said, it is sort of speeding up and gaining momentum in the United States. You see that the western coast and a good part of the northeast of the United States already have that legalization, and there are projects for reform in a number of other countries as well. There's also projects of referendum that are ongoing, and outside of the United States, there are a number of countries which are thinking about drafting a legalization. We can talk about Mexico, Australia. There's a project which is under examination at the moment in Parliament, and also in Europe. Luxembourg announced that they would like to legalize, but maybe this is not something that they will do eventually, but this is something that they do, and there are also projects in Switzerland at the moment. Third important point, there are differences in access depending on the region. Now, if you think about the general political process which gave birth to those reforms, you have different trajectories, so to speak. And I'm not going to go into all the details of this very busy table here, but you need to think about when that reform was placed on the agenda. You had some bottom-up reforms, and you also had top-down reforms. So either the initiatives came from grassroots level or the opposite. In the United States, legalization came through direct democracy, except in 5 states of the 19 I mentioned, and against the federal interdiction. So in Uruguay and Canada, the reform came from the top, came from the government. The legalization process, as well, what is interesting is the level of the opinion, public opinion. In Uruguay, the public opinion was not really in favor, except for younger people. And quite to the contrary to that, the reform in Canada was supported by the public opinion. That's even a promise that Justin Trudeau made when he was a candidate. Now, the third column of that table is the number of point of sales, active point of sales. And you can see that in the United States, the implementation became quicker as the number of states started to legalize. So in this, it took 6 months in Illinois, for example, even less in Arizona to have active point of sales after the law was passed, I mean. Now, the rate at which those reforms are passed also depends on the nature of reform. There are different systems of access depending on the state and depending on the country. In Uruguay, it's a lot more complex because there are 3 different routes. There are cannabis social clubs. You can purchase cannabis in the pharmacy, but you can also grow your own cannabis. And in other countries or other states, the private sector is responsible for providing cannabis. Now, the objective of those reforms, there are a number of converging points and a number of disparities. The first objective was to neutralize the black market and to weaken the crime net.
Les mineurs et réduire leur niveau de consommation de cannabis.
Also protect minors and reduce their level of cannabis consumption and better control the products in their composition, concentration level, and also the process of production and transformation. So those are the 3 common objectives. Now, there are also main differences. The objective was to try and have the upper hand again on the medical cannabis market. That was the case in the US, except in Arkansas, and that was the case in Canada as well. Also, reduce the race disparities in case of police controls. So more social justice. That was one of the expectations in the United States. Also have more taxes come in and foster economic development. That was there was a promise of extra growth. That was the case in the United States and Canada. Also, strengthen access to prevention and access to health solutions. That was also a promise in Canada and in Uruguay. And again, depending on the country, the idea was to avoid substitution. So avoid use of cocaine because obviously cannabis in Uruguay was of poor quality. And in Canada, the objective was to reduce also the consumption of alcohol, for example. So there are also different cultural and social contexts. They are very different. And so they vary very much from one country to the next or one state to the next as well. Among the common points, there's this underlying idea that cannabis legalization is going to regulate cannabis. And the idea is that the public power should regulate the market, and there's a sort of role from the state whereby the state should protect individuals. Now, this requires a strict framework for access to market, so a regulation of the different stakeholders. So in the United States, you have commercial markets. That's the case as well in some Canadian provinces. In Uruguay, the state is responsible for supply, or at least creating a framework for supply. And then you have different operators or stakeholders in the different states. You have different conditions of residency or citizenship. There's also the will of vertical integration. Vertical integration is possible in Colorado. Online sales is possible in some places, and also as is the authorization of marketing campaigns. Also, the scope for authorization and regulation is very varied. The age, the access age is different. 18 years of age in Uruguay, 21 in the States. In Canada, it's 18, 19, or 21. The maximum quantity is different as well. It starts at 10 grams per week in Uruguay to about 30 grams in Canada and most of American states. The way through which individuals can access, most states authorize self-culture. This is not the case in Washington, however. In Quebec and Manitoba and other Canadian provinces, this is not the case either. But in any case, the sale in between individuals is not possible. So there should be a monopoly on that market. And no consumption is authorized in the public sphere. This changed quite a bit during COVID, but I shall pick up on that later. And also the place where you can purchase cannabis is quite strict. There are areas that are out of scope, especially those areas where drug dealers are very much active. Now, another point of difference is the question of who regulates the entire market. You have either a public scheme or hybrid or purely private. But of the different regimes that we have, none of them is steered by the public health ministry. There are sometimes specialized institutes that were created, but they are not of the resort of the health ministry. Now, on the tax regimes, there are high differences between 10 and 15% in Oregon, for example, and it's a lot higher in California and in the state of Washington. And there's also, of course, an interest point on the tax innovations. those taxes become more sophisticated. For example, in Alaska, the tax is different depending on the weight, and in Illinois, the tax depends on the level of THC contained in the product. Now, the economic effects on the market. Of course, what's very important, as I mentioned before, is the rhythm of change, which is very different in the United States and Uruguay, for example. In Canada, the implementation of the reform is more or less quick. What's very striking in the United States is the rise of the cannabis business, as we call it. Was the case in Colorado, maybe less so in Washington, but there was an enormous trend there. There's also an industrialization of the entire industry, which became more professional, more structured, and it became more financial, with a number of companies listed now. A number of companies producing and selling cannabis are now listed, and there are a number of challenges connected to that, because initially banks did not want to open accounts to such companies because they were afraid of being prosecuted. But since 2021, there's a new act which makes it possible for banks to provide accounts to companies selling those products. There's also the question of direct and indirect selling of cannabis. We're talking about 320,000 jobs, direct or indirect jobs. Once again, those data are not maybe fully accurate, but this gives a picture of how many jobs are connected to that industry. We should underline that those are not only jobs connected to production, transformation, and sales, but also biotechnology, research and development, tourism, private security, because of this federal prohibition. Some of the production sites could have been burglared, and you had to have security firms working for them. But there are also unexpected impacts, an increase in real estate prices in Seattle, for example, or Denver, so I'm told. Now, on the evolution of sales, this is a graph that I'm sure you've seen already. Those are the 8 first American states opening this market between the first and 6th year. 2 comments on that graph. So this is the increase in sales. So this is pretty unambiguous. The general trend, obviously, is a steep increase in all states without exception. Second point, second comment, is that the starting point of the sales is higher. So we were talking about 660 million for the first year in Illinois, twice as much, twice more than in Colorado, where they started sales in 2014. So in a matter of 2 years, the starting point is just higher. Now, what happened in lockdown? We talked about it during the first debate on Tuesday. So in the United States, we can see that it had little impact on sales. The lockdown had a little impact. There was a transient low in sales, but we see the same trends in Canada. And the sanitary crisis was even an occasion to widen the conditions of access to cannabis. For example, access to recreative cannabis or medical cannabis was recognized as an essential point of sale, which is not mundane. It is something very important here to mention. And there were also as well at-home deliveries that were authorized during lockdown and that are still possible today. So today you may have a license in Colorado, for example, to deliver cannabis at your client's doorstep. Now, this is a graph on the increase in tax revenues. We're talking of $630 million in California as of the second year. There are 3 factors explaining this. Well, first, there's more local demand. The tax regimes are more or less binding as well. And also there's the place of the black market. The black market remains strong, more or less strong, depending on the state. Now, you should also introduce nuances there. This represent less than 1% of the revenues of a state, so it's not that big of a revenue source as you may think. And then there are a number of questions on the redistributions of those revenues. The state of Washington is using most of that on health, when Oregon and Colorado use that to build schools, for example. But then again, there are strong differences in between the states. Now, the common point is that it helps in reducing public deficits. Now, behind those figures, there's a strong and deep-reaching momentum of diversification of the general offer. Cannabis proposed for sales today is not only cannabis that can be smoked, but also liquid for e-cigarettes, cosmetics, supplements. They're also having niche markets for elderly people. And then you have a number of other products like dabs and other types of products that can contain up to 90% of THC, and the health impact are pretty much unknown for those products. Now, you have the example of Colorado. This is the diversification of the different products. So this, in the first year of legalization, 2014, 2/3 of sales was cannabis being smoked, so flowers. Now, today, it's about only half of the market in 2017. Now, the food products or supplement or edibles, as we call them, remain rather stable, while the concentrates doubled between 2014 and 2017. Behind that, you need to understand that you want to diversify the client base as well. So sellers want to, and the industry want to have as many products as possible to answer the needs of as many segments as possible. Now, when you think about regulations and health cautions, you see that the logo is very different. It's not homogeneous in the entire state. There's a single federal regulation in Canada. You have the same sort of logo than we have in France on cigarettes, for example. And in Uruguay, the packaging is not very sexy, but apart from that, there's no real logo. So this is very different from the cool marketing that you have in the United States, for example. You find the typical methods that you have in alcohol, for example, a lot of colors, nice design, really appealing and glamorous. There's a strong brand effect as well. You have one of those brands with a very strong resemblance to a sports brand that I'm not going to cite here. And there are many gimmicks and references to generations. You have a very strong marketing side to that. You can see, for example, MedMen, which was created a few years back. They have a number of retail stores, 30, if I'm getting that right. And you see the type of campaigns that they have. And that campaign is really oriented at normalization of that consumption. So this campaign, for example, is striking out the word stoner, which is changed by a more regular name: entrepreneur, officer, designer, with female and male, all ages. So that's really, again, in favor of a normalization. So you have a grandmother here, apparently, who's cool because she's smoking weed. Obviously, there's a reference to Mad Men, of course, and also of the potential medical interest of cannabis with MedMen for medical, right? Now, evolution in price. The decrease in price was very steep in a number of states. You have here the prices in a number of states, and you do see that the decrease in price is quite significant. Now, Uruguay is a very controlled market. You see here by the different sources, you have 60,000 users out 3.2 million inhabitants. So a small percentage of the population access legal cannabis, 22 pharmacies for the entire state where you can buy cannabis. I'm talking from Uruguay again. This is only 1% of the pharmacies. So that's a phenomenon which is a lot more limited and discrete than it is in the United States. And there's still a strong share of the black market. And the black market, of course, proposes cannabis with higher level of THC, higher level than on the controlled market. In the United States, it seems that there's an increase of usage by minors, underage use, 12 to 17 years of age. So you see that you have that trend. The situation is very different amongst legalized use of in people aged more than 25. So 2 comments on both graphs. So that's again very different depending on the age range. Once again, in the United States, there's a strong increase of use by senior citizens, and all states legalizing cannabis use are a lot above the average. The average was the dotted line on the graph. In Uruguay, the trends was not able to stop the general trend towards younger use of cannabis. So the consumption of cannabis continues to increase in the general population, continues to increase. Underage use continues to increase. So those figures are of 2018, and so we can suppose that 1 minor in 10 already used cannabis in the last month before this, for that graph. Now in Canada, we're looking back at only a few data. Those are quarterly data. The trend is not spectacular. However, there's a slight trend to increase, which is different depending on gender. It seems that women tend to have a stronger increase. In British Columbia, it seems that there's also a stronger increase than in other provinces. In Canada, you should also note that there's a current revolution. The share of daily use increased from 5 to 8% in a matter of 2 years only. So a strong increase. I'm talking even quicker, says the speaker, and I don't know how I'm going to keep up. Anyways, in all states where they legalized the use, a strong increase in adults. Underage use seems to be on the decrease, except in Uruguay, as I mentioned. Impact on public health. You have a question of acute intoxication, which is of course connected to highly concentrated forms, more hospitalization or ICU people. Because of that, the long-term effects are not known. The effects on health are not known on the long term when you use those highly concentrated products. Now we have less people in treatment, and the representation of cannabis are also changing. You have here the representation and the perceived risk in youth, and you see that the legalization of cannabis has a deleterious impact on the perception of risks. So in other words, those young people are under the impression that cannabis is less dangerous than they used to think in the past. So they do not realize, teenagers do not realize that cannabis can be dangerous. I'm reaching the end, says the speaker. Amongst the social effects, that the social acceptability of cannabis legalization. This is for the United States as a whole. The question asked was, what do you think of the use of cannabis? The acceptability was less than 20% in the 70s. So, but since the first initiatives were made public, now close to 70% of the general population is in agreement with a legalization of non-medical cannabis. So from 20 to 70%. Now, on public security and crime, the effects are not well documented. This is not something that you have in prevalence studies. However, what we can see from a number of statistical data, for example, from the Ministry of the Interior, as we call it here, it seems that there are less crime connected to that. And unfortunately, the impact that was claimed to have less race-based disparities, it seems that the effect is exactly the contrary. There's also a strong resilience from the black market. In Canada, 43% of consumers are still getting their drugs on the black market 2 years after legalization. In Uruguay, we're talking about 50% 7 years after legalization. So 1 consumer in 2 still uses the black market. So again, strong resilience from the black market. How can it be explained? Well, to shortage in cannabis that there was in cannabis and Uruguay is simply because the producers cannot meet the demand, and for that reason users continue to use the black market. And the second point, of course, it's difficult to meet the demands in Uruguay, again, because users want to have higher THC rate and they are frustrated with the products that are available on the legit market. When it comes to trafficking and crime, it's difficult to really measure the impact. I'm almost done, says the speaker. Now, the impact on weed being seized or confiscated, there's apparently a general impact, so reduction in the amounts, in the quantities. An impact on driving and road security. The impact, again, is a reason of controversies, and people don't necessarily agree on that. And I'm sure that John HUDAK will also mention the different controversies and the different challenges. The impact on the environment, for example, are difficult to measure. There's no control on pesticides because of the federal prohibition. So this is a product which is not controlled by FDA, for example. The consumption of water and electricity also poses a number of questions in terms of sustainable development. The second batch of challenges are the expungement expungement law or act, which was placed for social equity. So positive discrimination was implemented. And beyond that, there's a sort of unionization of this sector, and this question of social equity is certainly at the core, at the center of the debate. There's also a lack of knowledge, a lack of understanding. So we need to fund research in neurosciences, more quantity data and more quality data. Sorry for being so quick and for exceeding the time allocated to me. Okay, so if we have time for debate, I'm sure that we'll be talking about many of the points that you mentioned as well. Now, without further ado, we are going to give the floor to the next speaker. I seize the opportunity while John is walking to the podium, and I would like to mention the fact that Patrick AEBERHARD is also is in the panel. He used to be the president of
the founder of
Médecins du
Médecins du Monde, and he was the one to foster harm reduction, and he's always been fighting for harm reduction. So he's been leading the harm reduction society. He's also been part of the team working with Bernard Kouchner for the legalization of drugs, and he's also worked with Bernard Roque, and for all the team of BZIA, and for me, he's always been an example to follow, and he's given us a lot of joy with Pierre Brady and the friends who are here with us. And well, John, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, everyone. I will be as quick as possible, I promise. I will also try not to speak too quickly for our dear translators who will have to keep up both with an American who speaks quickly naturally and someone who wants to get through a lot of content. As Ivana mentioned in the previous presentation, the United States has taken a very unique approach to cannabis regulation in the United States. In the United States, oftentimes drug policy is dealt with at the federal level. What has happened over the past 10 years for adult use cannabis and 25 years for medical cannabis is that states have directly violated national law and taken drug policy, drug reform, cannabis reform specifically into their own hands, oftentimes hoping that federal intervention would not shut those systems down. That has generally been the case. And in the process, they have done what is often referred to as engaged in the laboratories of democracy. That is, each state has very different systems to regulate cannabis within their jurisdictions. There is a lot of overlap, for sure. What you can see is the fingerprints of previous states that have gone before all over the systems that come later. But what also happens is something important, something that the American system was designed to do, that any federalist system is designed to do, and that is to allow policy learning to happen. And so what we're seeing is policy learning happen across states. That is, as I mentioned, states that legalize later, that begin to regulate later, recognize that mistakes were made early on and that those mistakes can be overcome in the new systems. That's an important feature of American cannabis regulation, that type of learning over time and across space. But that learning also occurs within states. What we're seeing in Colorado and in Washington and in Oregon that were among the states to legalize first is that those states are recognizing that mistakes were made early on. Sometimes that was made early on because no state had done this before and they were bound to have some failures exist. In some cases, the landscape within those states has changed, whether it's from an industry perspective, whether it's from a consumer perspective, whether it's from a public health or public safety perspective. And so states have been responsive to their own challenges and their own failures, not perfectly, for sure. A lot of challenges still exist at the state level, but states want to get this right. One of the real concerns after the early states that have legalized was the idea that an American term we have is to throw the baby out with the bathwater. That is to say that because there are minor policy problems within these programs, we should throw away cannabis regulation entirely and return to prohibition. It's important to note that of all of the states that Ivana mentioned in her presentation, not a single American state that has legalized cannabis has then gone back and changed their mind on it. And in fact, public opinion polling suggests that in every state that has legalized cannabis, public support for the existing system either matches or is higher than the exact rate of passage for public initiatives that legalized cannabis. So that policy learning is important. Something else has changed in the American system, in the American conversation around cannabis, particularly over the past 4 years, and that's an additional focus on racial and social justice. The realities of drug policy in the United States is a dark and embarrassing chapter in American history. Drug regulation, and specifically cannabis regulation in the US, was put into place specifically to discriminate against certain groups. Initially, it was Mexican immigrants into the American Southwest and Mexican Americans after that. Later, it was for African Americans and Native Americans as well. Later, that was extended to political enemies of certain presidents or members of Congress, including entire groups of individuals. And that bias drove American drug policy, not considerations over the harms of it, although harms certainly exist, not concerns about the ability of a state to regulate it or a government to regulate it, but rather the ability to gain politically by discriminating against certain groups. And that has had enormous effects on American public policy. At its height in the United States, over 800,000 Americans were arrested in a single year for simple cannabis possession. That is an enormous number, even in a country with 300 million people in it. And the racial biases exist within those arrest rates. So on average, despite usage rates between Black Americans and white Americans being about equal, Black Americans are 4 times more likely to be arrested for a cannabis offense in the United States. That is true in states that have not legalized, and in states that have legalized, the sheer number of arrests of any individual has dropped dramatically. It makes sense when something is illegal and then it suddenly becomes legal, there will be a decrease in arrests and in incarceration for it. But racial disparities continue. They are muted some. That 4 times more likely figure drops to about 2.5 times more likely. But for anyone who has been observing police policy in the United States over the past several years or decades or centuries, it will come as no surprise that racial injustice is institutionalized into the police state in the United States. And that is true for individuals who die at the hands of police officers in the US, but it's also true down to basic street level arrests for something such as simple cannabis possession. The efforts in the states to change that has been significant and progress has happened, but it has not yet solved the problem. There were a lot of benefits prescribed for cannabis legalization in the United States, and some of them have been achieved. Cannabis products are safe and consistent in terms of understanding what you are actually purchasing when you go to a dispensary. Advances in testing in American states has meant that the presence of things like mold or adulterants or hard metals are more aggressively being regulated, so that even if you are purchasing a product that carries with it potential risks, those risks are being muted in some sense by a consumer knowing exactly what they are getting and exactly what they are not getting, what is not in that product. There are guards in place to check to make sure that minors are not purchasing cannabis in the United States. Data from the Cato Institute show that in the states that have legalized cannabis, checks for IDs for minors is actually better for cannabis than it is for tobacco or alcohol. In some states, as high as 98% compliance with identification checks to help guard against youth use. There's been increases in research from a medical perspective, from a public health perspective, and from a public safety perspective that have all become benefits for cannabis legalization. At the same time, opponents of legalization in the United States took a very problematic approach during the policy debates around this issue. Rather than thinking or communicating clearly about the real risks that cannabis legalization could present, they painted a fire and brimstone approach to what would happen if legalization happened. Claims that children would be passed out joints in elementary schools, that roads would be filled with intoxicated drivers, killing people and driving through schoolyards because they were too high to drive straight. Of course, none of this manifested. And in fact, in many cases in the United States, we found that youth use has held steady post-legalization. In some cases, it has declined. Initial peaks in driving under the influence of cannabis have largely leveled off in states. And so for a lot of Americans, they look at the system and they look at the claims that were being made by opponents of legalization and realize that those did not come to fruition. Now that's a double-edged sword. It's good in the sense that people are responsive to policy realities, but it could also create a false sense of security that because the most dire problems did not manifest, that now we don't have any problems. And nothing could be further from the truth. Challenges still exist in the cannabis system in the United States, and they are many. It is not to say they are insurmountable, but they are many. States have dealt with oversupply that have made prices crash and businesses fail. That was particularly true in Oregon. It is about to be true in the state of Oklahoma. The state of Oklahoma has about 3 million individuals in it, and their new cannabis system that is not fully up and running has over 800 dispensaries in that state where you can purchase cannabis. They are going to have a massive oversupply problem in the next year or two that will need to be addressed. There are concerns about diversion, that is legal product being diverted from the legal market to the black market and sold under different conditions. Market consolidation, as Ivana touched on, is a problem. Not only are there large cannabis businesses in the United States that are taking up huge parts of the market, but the forces behind those businesses are problematic and concerning to some, including the presence of pharmaceutical companies, big tobacco, and big alcohol as well. And federal illegality also presents a lot of serious challenges in the US. Because cannabis is still illegal under all circumstances under federal law, it creates challenges for tax policy, for banking policy, and a variety of other issues in the federalist system. I'll quickly divert to two areas before I wrap. One, looking at traditional public health metrics and what I would consider a non-traditional public health metric that I think needs to be built into the debate, and I've been arguing needs to be part of this broader debate about cannabis legalization, not just in the United States, but around the world as well. We know that with adult use cannabis, that there have been some increases in adult use in those states. That's to be expected. If something is now legal, more people are likely to use it. But one of the challenges that's often overlooked, or rather the focus is oftentimes on adult use cannabis, and less so nowadays on medical cannabis. But medical cannabis actually creates some challenges in the US, not so much around rates of use across the public, but rates of use within subpopulations. And so what we know happens particularly for medical cannabis is that heavy users oftentimes end up using more. We have what's often referred to as an 80-20 rule in the United States. 80% of the product is consumed by 20% of the consumers, not 20% of the public, 20% of the consumers. That means that heavy users use a lot. What we're finding, particularly in states like Colorado over the past few years, is that the 80-20 rule is transitioning closer to a 90-10 rule, that 90% of the product is being used by 10% of the population. This creates real concerns about mental health and addiction issues within these states that have legalized. And one of the biggest worries that I have in discussing this issue with advocates, pro-cannabis advocates, is that there are a non-trivial number of cannabis advocates who will tell you that cannabis is not addictive, that cannabis use disorder is made up. For anyone watching the news in the United States, it will come as no surprise that there's a subset of our population that doesn't believe in science or data, but that has not transcended COVID and has also infected the conversations around cannabis as well. There are a lot of advocates who believe in addiction, who believe in cannabis use disorder, but there is some number that do not. And that force in that conversation can be deleterious to making the right types of public health and public safety changes to policy that are necessary. One of the other real concerns, and I'll jump to my last point, I promise, Jean-Pierre, is around the collection of data. I typically don't advise state governments, but when I do, or when I testify before states legislatures that are looking to legalize, one of the points that I make clear is that you need to create data baselines for the types of questions you are going to want to ask post-legalization. This is true for American states, it's true for the United States government, and it's true for any government around the world that is considering or sees in the future the potential of legalizing cannabis. Think about the questions you want to ask about the potential problems that may arise, and start collecting data as if cannabis were legal now. Because if you don't have those pre-legalization baselines, it's much harder to make claims about the effect of legalization on all of those criteria or all of those categories of data that you want. Sadly, states typically don't do this, and then the conclusions that can be drawn are limited, but it is something that is essential to making good public policy choices and having a good understanding of the effects on public policy that cannabis legalization can have. The last point I'll touch on, and I'll do this briefly, I'm happy to discuss this later as well, is the non-traditional public health concerns that exist. Oftentimes, we think about public health in the United States with regard to cannabis legalization as what are the problems that end up existing when we legalize? And that is an important question to ask. What we rarely ask is what are the public health problems associated with prohibition? What we know in the United States is that mass incarceration is a serious problem, driven in large part by drug policy, but driven by other choices over our penal system in the US. We know that individuals who are incarcerated have a likelihood of recidivism, that is committing crimes again, sometimes the same crimes, sometimes other crimes. We also know that mental health and addiction challenges exist significantly for those who are incarcerated, and the rates of mental health and addiction challenges among those returning to society from incarceration are quite high. We know that having a criminal record in the United States decreases your opportunities economically, financially, and educationally. And we know that there are lower public health outcomes and lower individual health outcomes for individuals who face lower economic progress, lower educational attainment, et cetera. We know that poor health outcomes exist in communities that are hit hard economically and hit hard by the prosecution of certain crimes. That is a concentration that is geographic, and it is a concentration that is demographic in the United States. Prohibition in the US has created enormous public health challenges in this country. It is not to say that legalization is always the answer or necessarily the best answer, but any conversation about legalization in the US or around the world, particularly in places where racial minorities are discriminated against by drug policy, it's been true in Canada, the recent ballot initiative in New Zealand focused on this issue as well in part, needs to think not just about the impact of legalization, but the decades or centuries of impact of prohibition, and have a more holistic conversation about public health policy, and not simply a conversation about youth use, driving under the influence of cannabis, and heavy users using in heavier ways. And so I'm going to wrap there to be mindful of time, and I'm happy to entertain any questions from this afternoon.
Thanks a lot. Donc, Milton. Sí, 15 minutos, por favor. Estupendo. Ok. Ahí está. Bueno. Buenas tardes a todos y a todas.
Okay, so good evening, everybody. And thank you very much. It is an honor and it is a pleasure. Tomorrow I will talk about pleasure. But today it is a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you, Ivana, for sparing me a lot of data that you have already given. I will just specify certain things. And thank you to my predecessor, because I think that he said very interesting things. But the most interesting of it all is that today our friends from Biarritz keep opening discussion, because one of the worst things that prohibitionism can lead to is to a narrow-minded perspective and the impossibility to debate. You know, I've been a representative of my country. I've been an ambassador at the Commission for Drugs since 2008. And what we're opening up here today, what we can discuss here today with excellent people, well, it is impossible to discuss about this in the Drug Commission in my country. The sheer mention of harm reduction in a legal test has been like a huge struggle. So we may think that this is unbelievable, but this is so. The law for regulation and control of cannabis in Uruguay was approved in 2013. It was regulated in 2014. And then after that, it just started to be enforced. And the regulated market, well, let me say that I'm going to make some clarification here, something that I have talked about with many dear friends. The Uruguayan model is a strict model for a state control. It does not prevent the participation of civil society, because the strategic goal is to regulate the markets. And of course, it's obvious that the illicit market cannot be in the hands of criminal organizations. I mean, this is just obvious. It's quite simple to understand. However, the problem is that legal markets for alcohol, for cigarettes, and the big pharma Well, you know, the States has got a huge opioid use crisis with lots of fatalities, 70,000 people in the States dying for an overdose of opiates. I recommend you to watch a documentary in HBO. It's the crime of the century. It's that epidemic manipulation of opioid, pharmacological opioid. This has just scaled up so much. Therefore, I'd just like to say that Uruguay, let me find my slides. So, well, the most important thing. This is the first report that was published in December 2020, and this is the result of a mandate of the law, a legal mandate to monitor and to regulate markets. This is the result of a teamwork. It is made up of the work by a scientific and advice council who defined 5 dimensions to follow up. First of all, the implementation or enforcement of justice with equity. Secondly, safety and coexistence, health, global governance, and economic dimension. As our dear friend was saying, we have to set the foundations of everything, because what was actually really difficult between 2014 and 2018 in our country was to really set the foundations, the baseline, in order to measure what we wanted to measure. It's about the metrics again. So actually, I have to say that in spite of the fact of Uruguay having students who are experts in measuring, in metrics, and this allows us, for example, to make an analysis and to check whether use has increased or not amongst adults, for example. And of course, comparing this data with the general trend. And we can see that there has been an increase, but this just follows the general trend since 2001 of an increase in consumption in cannabis, which is third or fourth position cannabis in Uruguay. First of all is alcohol, then nicotine, and then psychopharmacological drugs, and then cannabis. So here you've got the figures. Here you've got the rate of the Uruguayan population between 15 and 65 years old, and we're talking about 15% cannabis use. And it's true that the use has increased as well amongst high school students. But if we assess the whole situation, all in all, this does not represent a significant modification if we take into account the general trend. However, what we must analyze, and this is the object of discussion, is the perception of risk. And also, well, the effects on health. For 2011 and 2018, 1% of hospitalizations are related to the use of cannabis, which means that these admissions are kept steady, However, I must say that psychiatrists and psychologists are giving much more information on the fact that there are lots of consultations and lots of appointments asked to get to know better about the harmful effects. And here I'm not trying to just smooth out the data. I'm just saying that there is an effect of social legitimacy, and this has a kind of correspondence with what the surveys are telling us regarding use. In Uruguay, the personal possession of drugs was never criminalized. The personal dosage for personal consumption of any kind of drug was not penalized. Now, there is a harder regulatory framework regarding access to cannabis, but I have to say that in Uruguay, personal possession was never criminalized because this was considered as something that we had defended in international fora. And actually, I would like to seize the opportunity to say that this was a central access. It was a conceptual access, just as the fact of regulating markets. And here, I would say that not only should we regulate, we have to control the market, because otherwise, this is an attempt against health, especially when we're talking about drugs, and even more if we're talking about illicit drugs. And secondly, in Uruguay, the regulated cannabis market was not achieved after a popular initiative. We had a massive opposition by the public opinion, 66%. This was not part of the left-wing ideology. It was just an appeal that was used by the president, Mujica, for something very specific related to safety. And it was quite a restricted vision at the time. And I would like to really say that even though they were, this situation is trying to rule out trafficking. Well, it does not achieve so. Legalization and regulation of drugs will lead to a better coexistence. But trying to think that this will solve the criminal policy of a country, this is a totally different story. It will not solve the criminal situation, because criminal organizations, they're just like a multinational firm, and they have different portfolios and they keep changing. So in the same way as in a country, criminal organizations of cannabis and marijuana are founded on organizations like it's the case for tobacco. We have a similar situation that the one we found in Galicia. And once these organizations have the know-how, they have their client portfolio, they're going to act everywhere, and they're going to achieve everywhere. So then, why regulating? Well, because this is a fundamental pillar. And then what we also wanted to defend in the Commission for Drugs, and now at the General Assembly of the United Nations for Drugs, I have to say that integration and the suitability of human rights instruments goes hand in hand with policies for regulating drugs. If you check the conventions that control all of this, and it's quite easy to do, you can review text, you will never find a mention being made to human rights. Human rights. I will spare you the audacity to say that it's because of Uruguay. But I have to say that mentioning human rights was something that was quite resisted. Because I remember some delegations in our country saying, oh, human rights, no, this belongs to Geneva. So, but how is this possible? I mean, we're talking about consumption, pleasure, the right to pleasure, the right to health, the sovereignty of the body, in spite of the risks. So, for that purpose, well, we have a model of harm management, even though there is a lot of resistance. But there is a prevalence of human rights on a set of problems, including drugs. And they're still sentenced to death for drugs, for crime regarding drugs and for consumption. And every year, Uruguay insists in issuing a declaration for a prolongation or a postposition of the death sentence. But we never achieved, even though Uruguay keeps trying to avoid the situation. But unfortunately, there are no initiatives, and we cannot talk about decriminalization, the possession of drugs. And we are still facing a pandemic in prisons, even though it seems nowadays that, well, in Texas, the situation's starting to change. I'm done. Okay. So let me say, to conclude, that the central axis of institutional engineering is the Institute for Control and Regulation of Cannabis. You can have a look at it. That's the website, and you will find here all the information regarding concessions of patents, research, public opinion, which today, public opinion regarding adult use cannabis for recreational purposes, well, now we have a slight advantage amongst those who are favorable compared to those who oppose. And now we have an acceptation of almost 90%, as well as for exploitation of the plant, actually, for industrial purposes, which is not a crime, of course. But the most important, according to me, is not that we have gained that percentage or that share compared to drug trafficking, because drug trafficking is still important in spite of all the developments that we've made. What I find really important is that there's part of the Uruguayan population who have registered in order to access cannabis in pharmacies, or in order to grow cannabis, or in order to buy some cannabis at certain clubs or shops. You have to register. Therefore, this means that we have to assemble an entire system that will contain some sensitive data. And of course, one of the drawbacks is that today we have a government which is exactly opposed to the previous ideology. So it seems that the new authorities would like to pierce this development, and it seems that they want to get into the database, even though it was not possible. Therefore, there are more than 60,000 people in Uruguay who registered, and then they just need to go to the pharmacy and use their fingerprint, and then they can access their weekly allowance of cannabis. Because this is the right of the user. It's 498 grams for self-growth, which means that you're allowed to have 6 plants in every household. And then there's also an allowance in clubs. So there are 3 ways to access legal cannabis in Uruguay. And well, this is it for me. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening.
Pour revenir sur beaucoup d'aspects, mais c'est vrai que les 2 derniers orateurs qui évoquent l'impact aussi sur les droits de l'homme, ce n'est pas tout à fait étranger à ce débat. Donc, juste pour faire le lien entre...
Very quickly, to connect those different topics, so legal framework, market, crime. Christophe, I think you are going to tell us in about 10 minutes about your book and what you're talking about in that soon-to-be published book. So good evening. I'm going to talk. Again, I thank you very much to Jean-Pierre. I was invited to provide a snapshot of drug traffickings in France and in particular in Marseille. I will zoom in, obviously, in Marseille because the situation in that city is not the one which is representative of the whole country. And this may be one of the future challenges and topic that will be at stake during the future presidential elections. Now, in France, the amounts of drugs that were seized, 57 tons were confiscated since the beginning of the year, 37% more than in 2020 at the same period, and it was already a record year. So those are figures from the Ministry of the Interior. There were a lot of those drugs that were confiscated in the Antilles, in the Mediterranean basin, and one of the most known route comes from Morocco or Northern Africa. Cirasco is the institution in charge of the estimation of the monthly turnover of drug trafficking in Marseille, and this amounts to a 5-digit figure. So 5 tons of cannabis and 9,000 tons were confiscated in the whole department of Bouches-du-Rhône around Marseille. So this means that the police is being more and more repressive, is trying to arrest as many people as possible, but it looks like trying to empty the sea with a spoon, because magistrates and lawyers are trying to, or rather judges trying to put a halt to those networks, do not have enough time just to compensate for the new criminals joining those networks on a daily basis. Now, I had a speech on French Connection because, you know, French Connection is about heroin traffic network at the world level, and Marseille was the center of that French Connection traffic. Now, Marseille has always been a harbor open to the Mediterranean. It was a place for traffic of opium as well. And this is how Marseille also attracted a number of chemists who transform opium in base morphine. And there's a tradition, so to speak, as being the center of drug traffic. So we're talking about the 50s and the 60s. The Corso families, so families from Corsica, used to have their hand on this traffic. And then all those drugs would flow to the United States mainly. And the labs of Marseille were well known for producing the best drugs of the world, 90% pure. $1,000 was the cost of 1 kilogram of that drug back then, and it would cost 10 times more in the United States. And so you needed customers. Those were the local mafias and the big families in the United States that would be the customers. And then what they needed was a safe route to the United States. But then again, I'm not going to explain the whole history, how all this was completely was stopped with the specific Parisian brigades, etc. So that was the history of the French Connection in a nutshell and very quickly. But we're still at war against what we call shit in France. That's the word for cannabis. And so the comparison with French Connection here is not being made by chance. This traffic is, of course, less lucrative, bringing in less money, but still quite a lot of money. In the days, the Corsican families would have their hand on the entire chain, and this is the difference with the situation today. Today, those traffics are taking place mostly in the less privileged neighborhoods. That's the case in Marseille, but also in the small provincial cities. It's mostly in the less privileged neighborhoods, in the cité, as they are called. And I'm not going to insist too much on the way the go fast and so fast and fly fast and etc. So just another figure, in 2020, 60 tons of cannabis is produced. So every year there's an increase by 15 to 20%. In 2020, 77 people were killed in a number of altercations in between groups, rival groups. And Marseille is making the headlines every time there are such fights. This summer, there were 4 fights and 15 dead of fatality because of that. Now, of course, he had a lot of press coverage. President Macron was in Marseille, and the policeman there told me that it really has to do with wars for territories, to have your hand on some very hot spots, so to speak. And the traffickers are very young. So again, it's very different. In some neighborhoods, we're very talking about chaos and victims being younger and younger. So 2 phenomena here. Victims are younger and younger. And the second trait is that they're often killed with war weapons. We're talking Kalashnikovs here, heavy weapons that cost only 200 to 300 euros in those neighborhoods. And so with the money from trafficking, they can have, those expensive weapons. So we're no longer talking about French Connection and that sort of romanticized take on trafficking. It's not romantic at all. And that type of war is responsible for 20 to 30 deaths per year. There were 16 in 2018, and the highest number was 29 in 2016. So, as I said, the way those people are killed, some are also, so the competitors are also killed with 1 bullet, and then the body is burned in a car. So this is really a sort of ritualized way to kill the competitors. And this is for all the traffickers of cocaine, but also cannabis. And those are challenges and issues that, of course, are very difficult to solve. Obviously, the perpetrators are very savvy, and they are not caught. And there's also a rule called omerta. You're not talking about it in those neighbors, and it's impossible to have testimonials. So as I'm told, in Marseille, you have a high rate of unemployment. Everybody is unemployed. And so this, the first employer of all those young people are drug dealers. And in Marseille, you have a career plan if you want to work in drug. So they also recruit in Marseille young people coming from small provincial cities to work in their company, so to speak. So the teams change on a regular basis, and faces change on a regular basis as well. Now, to talk about the business around cannabis, this is a flowering industry, and in Marseille and elsewhere, it does boost an underground type of economy. But this is an economy which is a necessity for the livelihood of many of those families. We have an unemployment rate of 50%, and the rate of school absenteeism is also very high. And today, drug users and the cannabis traffic is really what gets those city or neighborhood going. And so this is something that is observed on a daily basis, and of course it's very difficult to tackle for the public power. Now in Marseille, there's a more lenient approach to drug users, less repression. So then the question obviously is who buys drug in those less privileged neighborhood? Well, the local bourgeoisie, the nice guys outside during the day come and purchase their drugs in those neighborhoods, and the sale itself is very professionalized, and that money is creating opportunities for those neighborhoods, opportunities that those young people wouldn't have if not working in that industry. And then this is reinjected in real estate, in cars, in restaurants, etc., etc. So many are depending on that sort of network. And on the other side of the Mediterranean, in Morocco, tons of cannabis arrive in Marseille. We know that the ware comes from Tanger, and Tanger now has a completely different face with a real estate booming. So the rights are known, but nobody is acting against that. That's one testimonial that I could get. I think that 90% of cannabis in Marseille comes from Morocco through Tanger. Now, the social workers I talked with told me that you have a lot more smokers, weed smoker in those less privileged neighborhoods, and so we have a lot of proponents or advocates of legalization of cannabis. For those social workers, they think that there are still very flourishing days for cannabis trafficking, whether it's going to be legalized or not in the near or not so near future. Cannabis trafficking are really putting on the garbs of entrepreneurs. They are not presenting themselves. They're presenting themselves like salespeople, and they have an organization which is very close to that of an entrepreneur. They have a very vertical organization with, a manager, and then your employees at the bottom of that organization. Now, of course, the problem with that structure, when the police goes in those neighborhoods, the people that they can jail or not jail are the ones that they arrest are mostly underaged, and they are selected by the said managers because they are underage. They cannot be put in jail, so they use quite many minors in those structures. Now, of course, in case of legalization, you may think that they would replace the type of product that they're going to traffic. I also met a police officer, and he said that jail is not the best weapon, because prison is also a place where those young people are going to meet other drug dealers, and it's even going to make the matter worse. So that war against drugs doesn't go through more criminalization. So there are different policies, and one of the policies by the government at the moment is to try and stop as many and arrest as many drug dealers as possible with a systematic approach, but it seems not to be the right take on it, according to many of the people that I was able to interview. If you want to completely remove this or really solve the situation, you should really tackle the different steps. So you need to cut heads, and you need to cut heads at the top level, because it will make the organization then more difficult. From a diplomatic point of view, from the testimonials I got, is that the solution is a political solution. The solution needs to be a political solution, and there needs to be a political way, which seems to be missing at the moment. Well, thank you very much for that. That was very interesting. And thank you to all the speakers. That was a very interesting session. That was, it's sometimes difficult to follow the different presentations because we went in different countries and we need to grasp all those ideas that are presented here. But let's come back to the current situation. So thinking about about human rights, for example, and also talk about legal drugs as well. Alcohol and tobacco are legal drugs, and France is potentially ranking first when it comes to the consumption of alcohol and tobacco. I don't know whether you read a paper which was recently published. They tested children aged between 12 and 16, and they checked whether those 12 to 16-year-old could purchase strong alcohol or tobacco without the ID being checked. And the result of this study is quite astounding. All those children were able to enter places, and only 20% of the shop owners refused to sell alcohol or tobacco to them. And now when we have debates like tonight, people say, oh, well, you're going to legalize cannabis and now children are going to smoke cannabis. Well, you know, those children already smoke cigarettes, right? So it doesn't have to do, it has nothing to do with legalization. So this is just a very provocative statement, obviously, before I start the debate. But I see here quite a lot of hypocrisy. And apparently, Morocco is thinking about legalizing cannabis. Have you heard about it? Yeah, so Morocco is thinking about legalizing cannabis. So that's great, isn't it? So we live in the center of complete absurdity. So some said that maybe this will change with the future elections, in France at least, but this is not going to change because during the electoral campaign, in France, again, it seemed that when a candidate promises to legalize cannabis, they usually lose the presidential elections. So I don't think this is something that is coming anytime soon. And I think we will continue to have extremely toxic products on the market. I think that school-aged children are going to be able to buy that. And this is going to continue with alcohol consumption and tobacco use on top of it. So this is what comes to mind after listening to you. And of course, we'd love to find solutions, because obviously when you talk about legalization or depenalization of cannabis, this doesn't mean that we're going to sell it freely to anybody, any product at any age, because this is not the case in any of the countries that have legalized cannabis. There are a number of rules that are really creating a framework to that legalization. Now, I have a question to the first three speakers. So I have a couple of questions. First question, use of cannabis by children. Do you have studies? Do you have precise documents? I know that there's a study where you said that there's a relative decrease in the use of cannabis by underage teenagers. So, for example, I know that in the United States, they do not have the right to smoke cannabis, but they therefore smoke black market cannabis. So do you have a persistence of black markets in your respective countries? And what is the impact on children of legalization? Second question, do we have reliable data on car crashes? Are there more car accidents before and after legalization? I mean, the comparison between before and after. And do you also see a decrease of black market in general? So for the United States, Uruguay, and for yourself, you didn't talk about Europe, or you didn't talk about Europe very much. Is it because, of course, we cannot talk about legalization in Europe, or did you voluntarily limit your analysis to Northern America and Uruguay? So those are the questions that I would like you to answer, if you'd please.
I'll start quickly. I'll run through all three of your questions. With regard to the use of cannabis by youth, there are a significant number of studies in the United States into this. What we've generally found, I'm not doing those studies, what has generally been found in those studies is that overall, cannabis legalization has not had a statistically significant impact on youth use. Now, when you begin to divide age groups up, that does begin to separate. So older teens, the 15 to 18 range, 15 to 20 actually, there is some evidence of slight upticks in that use. In the 12 to 15 or 12 to 17, depending on the study, you'll see a decline. But overall, that's not, it's not having that much of an impact on youth use. That is robust findings across a variety of studies done by a variety of different organizations using sometimes similar data, sometimes different data. One of the challenges too is that we measure this at the state level. And so there are some differences in initial youth use rates. So for instance, youth use in Colorado is significantly higher than it is in a place like Connecticut to start. But comparing those, within a state year to year, that's what we're finding. Second, the reliability of data on car crashes. This is actually a very difficult challenge. What we see typically in states post-legalization is that there's an initial uptick in both, actually in three areas. One, individuals being detained for driving under the influence. Two, individuals having car crashes involving a driver who tests positive for cannabis. And three, fatal car crashes in which a driver tests positive for cannabis. There's a few challenges here in measurement though. One of them harkens back to the point I made at the end of my conversation about reliable data. In a lot of states, they weren't testing for cannabis. They weren't testing drivers for cannabis specifically, or if they did test it, it would get coded as under the influence of a drug, a non-alcohol drug. And so we're not exactly measuring the same thing necessarily. The other is how they're measuring cannabis. So increasingly states are switching towards testing drivers for active cannabinoids in their system. Previously, oftentimes they were just testing for the presence of cannabinoids, whether they were active or inactive. And so that creates a real challenge for understanding exactly what's happening. For me, my argument is always assume that there is an increase in driving, there's an increase in association with car crashes, and then make public policy choices from the conservative perspective, the assumption that it is a problem and it needs to be addressed. On the last point, yes, and Ivana can talk a little bit more about this. There is an impact on the black market. It's not going away, but when you look at the figures of the amount of cannabis being sold, and you compare that to relatively slight increases in adult use, that has to be impacting. We're talking about, nearly 20 billion American dollars a year being sold for legal cannabis. That's having some impact on the market. But one of the things that people don't recognize is that cannabis users are rational economic actors. They're responsive to prices and taxes and access. And in a lot of American states, you have to drive, in some cases, hundreds of miles to the nearest dispensary. And if you're in a state where you can't cultivate at home, you're going to make the decision to continue with the black market.
Respecto a la pregunta de los niños, nosotros tenemos encuestas de estudiantes de enseñanza media que son jóvenes de... ¿Hola? Jóvenes de 13 a 17 años. Allí también no tenemos forma de discriminar el impacto de la ley de regulación, porque el problema que tenemos es que ya hace tiempo ha habido un aumento del consumo y sigue creciendo en forma moderada, de tal manera que 1 de 5 estudiantes de enseñanza media consume cannabis. Nada comparable a lo que es el alcohol. Nada comparable. Y los siniestros de tránsito que hemos tenido, en un tiempo fue una pandemia el tema del alcohol. Uruguay es un país raro porque hemos definido tolerancia cero para la conducción No se puede tomar alcohol si vas a conducir. Ni 0,3 ni 0,1, cero. Y eso sí ha tenido impacto en los siniestros de tránsito porque han bajado abruptamente. Y al principio, que había una gran oposición a la medida, fue aumentando, aceptándose paulatinamente. Por lo tanto, una cosa que le quería comentar a Ivana. A partir de ayer, los uruguayos nos pusimos más sexys. porque ha salido una nueva variedad que tiene un 9% de THC y un 3% de CBD. Esto obedece a que el mercado regulado, además de tener una gestión de riesgos, debe competir con el mercado negro. Si nosotros vendemos un cannabis que no tiene efectos, gana el mercado negro. Por lo tanto, y además esto se hace en consulta con los clubes canábicos, etcétera, etcétera. Bueno.
Oui, pour abonder.
Yes, with the black market is not going to decrease overnight. It's less and less according to the states. Overall, the consumption, the number of people who use the black market 2 years after legalization in Canada, and in Uruguay 7 years after legalization. So it's not the same rate. I didn't talk about Europe because I talked only about experiences of legalization of cannabis for non-medical use. And for the time, there is no country in Europe. Contrary to what is believed in Netherlands, it's just tolerance, is not legalized. You have legal access to cannabis in coffee shops with some restrictions, but this cannabis is produced in the illicit market, even if recently there's been experimentation to produce legal cannabis to supply the coffee shops. And the model of Portugal is not a legalization, but decriminalization. One point on that, because sometimes there's a confusion. In Morocco, for instance, it's not the same type of legalization as that we're talking about. It's a legalization of the production of cannabis for export. And it's cannabis for medical use only. Many countries started doing it in Africa, even in Southeast Asia, in Thailand. So this is very different. It's the idea that you're not going to miss this opportunity, this economic opportunity. Thank you. Before I give the floor to the audience, I'm going to ask Christophe whether he thinks that legalization in the US or Canadian terms, is it going to decrease violence in the cities? That's the big question. In 2019, the council recommended legalization of cannabis in France. It's politic. The problem is this violence that affects the youth in the States. Many says that now they're in Marseille. You have in Marseille what you have in the 70s in New York. 40, 50 years later, it's the same situation. And we have to see, we said how they legalized the legal companies. Will the traffickers, the small cannabis company can become legal companies? It's very complex. And there are also economic data, society data. Marseille, it's the northern districts in Marseille. They're isolated with no mass transportation. And our president has a major plan to help them. I don't think that legalization of cannabis is is going to happen in France soon. Especially with the people we have competed for the election. We're going to take questions from the audience. Who wants to ask questions to this exceptional panel? Well, you said it all. Bernard? I take this opportunity to say I was contacted after the report we did with Patrick by the House of Representatives. We had the TV, there was a TV show. I can send you the link. You can listen to it. You can watch it. There were very interesting things on it was an interview, and I answered questions. What came out of it? The representatives were not ready to legalize, but however, my colleagues, a sociologist who did the history of cannabis and a policeman from Marseille, they both said they were in favor of legalization with a very interesting arguments. I'm going to share that link with Jean-Pierre, and you will have my opinion and the opinion of the other two persons. Do you wish to add anything? Bertrand? Bertrand Veil. First of all, I'm impressed by the quality of the work of Ivana OBRADOVIC, and I try to read what she writes, and it's very, very interesting. I may be wrong, but in a way, I think that the issue of cannabis legalization is almost behind us. Maybe it's still going to take some time, but I don't think we're going to go backwards, to go back to the situation before. So the question now is to say, finally, did we do an exception because it was an error to classify cannabis in the international conventions? It's Egypt in 1925 that asked for cannabis to be included in the list of prohibited substances. And finally, it's the Marijuana Act 37 is a date of prohibition of cannabis. So things, as it sometimes occurs, end where they started in the United States. But there are other questions. And the statute of psychedelics in international conventions, this statute is becoming more and more absurd. Many studies show the interest of these substances in the conventions. They're classified as dangerous, as hazardous substances without any therapeutical interest. There's another question asked, that of the legalization, not of cocaine, but the coke leaf. One country negotiated a specific statute, it's Bolivia. They negotiated a specific statute in the framework of the convention so that this traditional consumption of coke is not forbidden by the conventions. So maybe these are the next two battles. Maybe they're going to focus on the situation of psychedelics, at least in the medical world, and on the situation of coke leaves in international conventions. Concerning the coke leaf, we may assume that if the coke leaf were legalized, the scary level of violence in some countries, in Mexico, for instance, where the cocaine wars led to tens of thousands dead, these wars will be less intense. They will not disappear. And the Mexican criminal groups have many substances to import into the States. But maybe this would quiet down the situation and this violence, this huge violence within cocaine traffic. And that will be my last words. I think that the real question is cannabis an error of appreciation, or is legalization of cannabis, is it the beginning of the deconstruction of the global prohibition regime which we have now on the planet? Thank you for what you said. On the legalization of psychedelics for medical use, there is a movement among the actors present yesterday in favor of the legalization of cannabis. We have the same today who want to legalize all drugs or those with a medical use. I think Oregon decriminalized the psilocybin, and things are happening in the States on psilocybin and other countries too. On the coke leaf, it's more residual. We feel that the walls, we're pushing the walls, but the prohibition is cracking now, and even at the United States, at the United Nations, especially around the issue of human rights that Milton will talk about tomorrow morning in a workshop. So the human rights issue is also a new way to approach this issue, to address this issue, and to change the regulation concerning illicit drugs.
So I won't discuss the coca leaf. I don't have expertise or experience in that area of policy, but I do agree that in many countries around the world, most citizens see the legalization of cannabis as a debate that is on its way to be over. We know that in most countries, there is a stark division between the views on legalization of younger people versus older people. It's true in the United States. It's true in most places in Europe and Latin America as well. And so as generational change happens, we are likely to see cannabis legalization, not universally, but in many places, to be essentially the foregone conclusion that we can see down the road. Now, on your point on psychedelics, I agree with you completely. This is the next battle in the drug reform war that we sometimes referred to as the war on drugs. And in Oregon legalized psychedelics in the past election. It decriminalized drugs generally. Where I live in the District of Columbia, we decriminalized psychedelics, natural plant-based psychedelics. And the argument in the District of Columbia was on two fronts. One was we should use police resources for something more important than stopping people from using mushrooms. The second was to Milton's point earlier about personal autonomy. And a lot of Americans increasingly, especially in liberal areas, but in some conservative areas too, see that right to personal autonomy as an important part of the conversation in broader drug reform. It was true in cannabis reform. It's why a very conservative, very Republican state like Alaska was one of the first to legalize. Alaska is known for that personal autonomy and that the libertarian forces behind that. And those ideas are coming together around psychedelics right now. We're seeing both individual voters being willing to think about psychedelics differently, and we're seeing incredible research coming out of universities and other institutions like the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies in the United States that is doing groundbreaking research around the use of psychedelics in the treatment of PTSD in veterans and other issues. And so I think the medical and scientific community is thinking about psychedelics dramatically differently than it was even 10 years ago. And the average American is thinking about psychedelics dramatically differently than they were 10 years ago. And I think that makes it that next front in, as I said, the war on drugs.
Sin lugar a duda, yo creo que lo del cannabis es apenas el comienzo de una sana y antitóxica forma de ver el control de drogas. Tenemos políticas de drogas que son...
Nous avons des politiques de drogue qui sont toxiques. Et comme disait Kofi Annan, les drogues ont fait beaucoup de mal. Drugs have done a lot of harm, but the drug policy even worse. The International Convention says that the objective of the legalization is well-being and the health of humanity. And the second principle, it's the purpose was to guarantee the medical and scientific use. What do you mean by scientific? Social sciences are part of it. All the states.
No, beyond
Ne respectent pas les conventions.
The respect of this convention is paramount.
Que 75% de l'humanité
75% of mankind
manque des calmants et des opiacés dont ils ont besoin pour calmer la douleur dans les étapes terminales de la vie. 75% de la population a besoin d'un usage médical.
They have a need for medical use of cannabis, and they have not access to
Bolivia
that.
had to get away from the convention.
Bolivia had to leave the
They went back to the convention because there was a clause in the 71 convention where Bolivia and Peru
presented Bolivia and Colombia to chew
traditional, which is absurd.
coca leaves, which used to be a traditional use
don't leave the convention.
Plants.
Stay in the convention,
and so they
because you are right.
And they couldn't continue to be part of the convention for that reason.
Bolivia
and Bolivia also has a regulation in
the coke leaf and in Colombia, and they're talking about regulation, legalization of cocaine. I think you cannot go backwards. It's irreversible, and I'm going to be frank, because the bank capitals see that it's a business for them.
Companies have seen the interest of
freedom, free trade. So you don't want to regulate criminal organization with an absurd application of the criminal law that always goes hand in hand with corruption. That is unavoidable. It's not a moral issue, but it's the police forces are involved in the market,
and often
and
the situation is such,
and there is the police goes hand in hand with the criminal groups.
Know that there are a number of overlap between the different.
Thank you, Milton. That can be the conclusion of this debate. If you want to carry on tomorrow morning in the workshops.
Thank you very much for talking about those different topics that were already mentioned in the different workshops. And I know that Milton gave a conference on human rights and legalization. And it's true that it's a topic which is, of course, a topic of conversation in Uruguay and in other Latin American countries. This is certainly a very interesting topic.
In particular.
Human rights and legalization. I also have a quick question. Cannabis is recognized as a trigger of schizophrenia in sensitive persons. Don't you think that it's going to increase the number of people suffering of schizophrenia? Again, young people.
You are reopening the debate that we had just closed. However, all these questions that were addressed throughout the day will be addressed again tomorrow. The interpreters and the staff, the technical staff of the auditorium, we already we were supposed to end at 7 p.m. But this question was addressed and was answered. What we're not going to reopen the discussion, but you are right, we must protect the youth. But the current situation in our country does not protect the youth. You know that in our situation, our youth are the most vulnerable, not only for schizophrenia, but vulnerable. The legal system in France, prohibition, does not prevent our youth from being in Europe the greatest cannabis users. So the debate remains open. We're not going to answer now. So between two evils, let's choose the least. If you want to continue this debate, come back tomorrow.